Welcome back to the Rum Ration, where history meets a stiff drink, and the stories are as strong as the Navy's grog.
You're Rejoy, and I'm Colin. Today, we're peeling back. Aren't we slick? We're really impressive here. But today, we're going to peel back a little-known chapter of military history, something that's kind of contentious, which we're going to dive into our own personal feelings towards the end. It's got some stories of extraordinary heroism and boldness, but it's a story that I think most Canadians aren't really aware of, about how many thousands, tens of thousands of Canadians fought in the Vietnam War, despite Canada not being officially involved.
Correct. And I really have got to stop having a little bit of rum in the morning to lubricate myself for this podcast. It's the ultimate story of, I wasn't there, but I was there. And very few people actually know about the Canadian involvement. I mean, it's anywhere between just 30 to 40,000 Canadians decided, you know what, this is something I want to do. And they went and they volunteered to fight in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's like sneaking into a bar brawl where you weren't even supposed to be at the pub in the first place.
Yeah, only to realize that this fight is going on for about 10 years.
Yeah,
So a little bit more than they expected. So, Colin, why don't you start us off? How did Canadians get involved in Vietnam?
Yeah, so here's the situation. Canada, the land of stereotypical politeness and peacekeeping, allegedly, officially said no thanks to sending troops to Vietnam. Our prime minister at the time, Lester Pearson, turned down the request from the Americans to join that conflict, and that was our official policy.
That's right, but it didn't stop individual Canadians from going down and fighting. Some went out of a sense of they wanted to get involved in this. Some went out of a sense of, as many young men do over the history of conflicts, just go for the adventure aspect of it, and some had ended up immigrating to the U.S. and getting caught up in the draft. And before they could say, actually, I'm not American, they were wearing the olive drab and heading out to the Nam.
Welcome to America. Imagine moving to New York for a job. Next thing you know, you're in a rice paddy getting shot at by the Viet Cong.
Talk about the worst relocation package of all time.
Check those benefits before you sign up.
Exactly. So what did they do in Vietnam, Canadians specifically?
Everything. They were involved in all aspects. They didn't just sign up for easy desk jobs. They were in the thick of it. They were fighting in the Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force. There were Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Rangers, you name it. Every aspect of military service in Vietnam, there were Canadians in part of it.
All arms, right? Really?
Yeah.
They were involved in the helicopter assaults. They were doing the patrols, the stereotypical grunt work. There were Canadians involved there as well. I think you're going to tell us a story about Peter C. Lemon, a Canadian-born U.S. soldier who won the Medal of Honor.
Yeah, Medal of Honor, just so everyone's aware in Canadian terms, would be it's the highest award you can get in the U.S. For bravery, the equivalent of the Canadian the Victoria Cross in Canada. And I think it's fair to say we were talking a lot about here tens of thousands of Canadians who went to South and joined up. Lemon was slightly different. He was born in Toronto, so yes, absolutely born as a Canadian. But he moved to Michigan as a child, about 2-3 years old. The whole family moved down there. And he did enlist in the U.S. Army. So full disclosure, I think it's fair to say that he could not be considered a Canadian who went south to join up, but he is of Canadian origin, and his story is just incredible. We got to tell it. On April 1st, 1970, at just 19 years old, he was stationed at Fire Base Illingsworth in Vietnam's Tay Ting province. And that night, after a long patrol, he decided to relax with a joint before hitting the sack.
As one does on a fire base, relax with a joint. Unbelievable.
Yeah, and he was just feeling the effects, apparently, around 2 a.m. when approximately 400 North Vietnamese soldiers launched a massive assault on the firebase. And despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1 and being a little stoned, Lemon sprang it at.
So that's a hell of a wake-up call, isn't it?
It's a hell of a wake-up call. But he was all in. First thing he did was man a 50 cal machine gun, pouring rounds into the oncoming enemy, and that's a pretty intense welcome. And when that jammed, he grabbed a rifle until it malfunctioned. Then, running low on options, he resorted to hand grenades. And when he ran out of those, he engaged in hand-to-hand combat, taking down enemy soldiers with his bare hands, actually being seen by several witnesses punching people and knocking out NVA with a punch.
That's remarkable. I mean, considering that, don't people smoke weed to relax? I mean, generally when you smoke up, you're kind of like chill and relax, but it seems uh, for Mr. Lemon, it was a different experience altogether.
Now, I'm not much of a pot smoker, but I have heard say that there are different strains and things are stronger now than they used to be, and
Ah,
you can get different weeds. And I believe there are bud tenders. You can go into these stores and you can say, "Hey, I'm looking for something to take the edge off of, or I'm looking to unwind, or I'm looking to kick 400 NVA soldier's ass and engage in hand-to-hand combat while emptying a 50 cal belt into them." Do you got something for that? So maybe there's a different strain, right? But all kidding aside, it didn't stop there. Amid all the chaos, there was a massive explosion that rocked the base because they had stacked up a whole bunch of unused artillery shells to be evacuated the following day, and they were all in the center of the camp, and
mhm.
something hit them and caused them to go off. So there's a massive explosion
Oh,
that created a huge crater. Uh, and despite being wounded and multiple wounds, Lemon carried a wounded comrade to safety, refused medical treatment for his own wounds, and then returned to the fight, grabbing more grenades and continuing the defense until he collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion.
it's incredible. I mean, it puts things in perspective. The other day, for example, I stubbed my toe, and I thought, well, gritting my teeth in pain and only taking a week off from work in order to recover from the stubbed toe. And I thought I was strong about that, but my God, this guy is something else, eh?
You were strong about that, and I was sad to see that the Governor General turned down your request for a bravery medal.
No,
It was kind
I'm
of sad.
reapplying.
You should, yeah. But speaking of medals, Lemon said himself that he later said he didn't think he deserved the Medal of Honor. And after the war, Lemon became a motivational speaker and an advocate for veterans. He was very successful academic-wise and in business, but he started wearing his medal to honor the memory of those who didn't make it.
Yeah, that is very poignant, and his story is a very powerful example of resilience and then sacrifice. Uh, like you said, he was born in Canada, but he probably really did think of himself as an American, and maybe that's one of the reasons. Also, his story is not largely known here in Canada. What he
Yeah, of
went
course. I
through,
mean, his
right?
actions, though extraordinary, were obviously largely unrecognized in Canada. We weren't officially there. We wouldn't be going out of our way like we do for every successful movie star or comedian or whatever. We're all like, oh, he's Canadian. I mean, he hasn't lived in Canada for 75 years, doesn't pay taxes in Canada once in his entire life, but we're very quick to say he's a Canadian. We weren't doing that in this example here. So he was unrecognized. And it wasn't until years later, after his story really started to gain attention, that it underscored the broader issue of Canada's reluctance to acknowledge its Vietnam veterans.
True, and it also sort of brings up the conversation again of Canadians in Vietnam, and there were so many. I mean, his is an exceptional story, but there are others who really did go across the border, go down south. One of them is this Daniel Cunningham, which he has a very interesting story. Now, he was one of the Canadians who went across the border down south and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps in 1969. And his reason for doing so was basically just seeking purpose after going through personal struggles, as many young men do. He served as a grenadier with the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, and quickly discovered what real war was all about. He was deployed with the 1st Corps, uh, firefights, cruising patrols, all the stereotypical stuff that most people are familiar with, stories of Vietnam. And then he returned home. And by returning home, I mean he came back to Canada, where he received no recognition, of course. The government did not acknowledge its citizens who fought in Vietnam. And like many veterans at the time, he experienced alienation um, and loneliness, but he never regretted serving. He never regretted going. In fact, he said he only wished he had joined sooner. He really believed in what he was doing. So his story, I think, well, kind of reflects the complicated legacy of Canadian Vietnam veterans. They fought for a cause that they believed in, but not necessarily one that was aligned with what the country believed in.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of why we're here, right? It makes you wonder how many other Canadian-born fighters had their heroism overlooked, and we're here to kind of shed light on some of these forgotten fighters and give them the recognition they deserve.
Yeah, and that light, let's raise a glass to Peter Levin, Daniel Cunningham, and all the unsung Canadian heroes of the Vietnam War. Cheers to them.
Cheers to them as we drink coffee, and you're probably drinking water. And even though we have a podcast called the Rum Ration, I don't think either of us have once had rum when we're making it.
Still waiting for that.
Still gonna, yeah, I think we're gonna have to do that. But cheers to their bravery and their sacrifice, and may their stories never be forgotten.
Indeed.
We're gonna dive a little deeper into the experience of other Canadians who served in Vietnam.
But before we do that, why don't we go for a quick word from our non-sponsor? It's time for our ever-popular Wish We Had a Sponsor segment, proudly fueled by Pusser's Rum, even if they don't know
it. Even if they ignore us. Smooth, strong, and historically accurate, just like our storytelling. And if Pusser's was any more essential to this podcast, we'd be issuing it as part of the standard kit.
So raise the glass, lads. If Canada won't recognize its Vietnam vets, we'll at least toast them properly with the Navy's finest. So, let's talk about the casualties and casualty rates now.
That's right. Now, despite the heavy combat, the casualty rate for Canadians was relatively low. At least 134 confirmed deaths that we know of, although the real number is likely higher because it's how do you define a Canadian? Was it someone who was born in Canada and moved to the States just for the conflict, or was it somebody and with the intent of returning, or was it someone like Peter Lemon who was living in the States of Canadian origin?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, they said the overall U.S. casualty rate was about 2.7%, and Canadians had a lower rate, around 0.33 to 0.45%. But again, as you quite rightly pointed out, I mean, what defines a Canadian soldier? I mean, how do you get those statistics? But that's the going estimate here. And according to the CBC, it's estimated that some 12,000 Canadians served in combat during that war.
In combat roles. Yeah, there were many more.
In combat roles, yes.
Yeah, in combat roles. Yeah, thank goodness they didn't suffer such a high casualty rate, but it certainly couldn't have been a picnic for them.
No, not at all. I can just imagine how difficult it is to get help. I mean, even in the aftermath of today's conflicts, where Canadian soldiers have been deployed and coming back from Afghanistan, getting help has been a challenge. So back then, it could only have been even greater. I can imagine stuck in a form of bureaucratic limbo. I mean, what do you say? What do you do? Right? So let's talk a little bit about what Canada actually did during the war. This is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, because officially Canada wasn't involved, but unofficially, well,
let's just say there was a lot of looking the other way, selling military supplies to the U.S., everything from, I didn't know this, plane parts to ammunition and even chemicals that were used in Agent Orange.
Yeah, so Canada was basically saying, we won't fight, but here's some gear and material and equipment we can sell you to help you win. And we're seeing similar situation in Ukraine. It's not the first time we've seen this before. Canada and other countries taking advantage of a conflict for economic gain. We're seeing this in Ukraine right now and other places around the world today.
Sure, I mean, it goes back even back to the times of the Spanish Civil War, I'm sure, where, cartloads of arms are being sent across to different sides. And while that was happening at the same time, Canada was accepting all sorts of what the infamous draft dodgers. So Americans who refused to fight or didn't believe in the cause and were coming over to Canada. I think there were tens of thousands of them, weren't there?
Love the contrast. Canada saying, no, we won't send troops. Here's some supplies. And also, if your soldiers don't want to fight, we'll take them in. Interestingly enough, and this is a stat that will likely shock a lot of people's perceptions of the peaceful Canadian, but more Canadians served in Vietnam than Americans moved to Canada to dodge the draft. Think of that again. More Canadians served in Vietnam than Americans moved to Canada to dodge the draft.
Amazing. Well, that's realpolitik at its finest, isn't it? Would never have imagined that would have been the case. But there you are. So then we move into the post-war era, post-war Vietnam era, I mean, of course, and post-war recognition or lack thereof.
Yeah, and this is the part where it's a little contentious, and you and I talked about this before the podcast.
Yes.
I think we can dive into it a bit more on how we both feel about it, because the reality is these Canadians who went down that we talked about, the kicker is when they came back, Canada, because it wasn't officially Canada's war, veterans received absolutely nothing from Canada. There was no official recognition, no parades, no veteran benefits. I mean, if they had been decorated or received something in the U.S., they would have received that and been given that by the American government. But they didn't have any status in Canada. And I know there are a lot of people who are pretty upset about that. Personally, my feeling is they weren't there fighting for Canada, representing Canada. Why would the Canadian government be responsible for granting them veteran status and looking after them?
Yeah, that's right. I agree with your point of view there as well, and it's something we were also talking about a little bit. It wasn't Canada's war. Um, as an American ally, the Canadian government supported the American government in different ways, but didn't believe in getting involved in conflict. So any decision I think made by uh, a private citizen to enlist in the American Armed Forces and go across to Vietnam is a private decision. So for the
Yeah, that's a
government,
good point about the private part, because there have been private memorials erected. The Canadian government has refused to allow any of them to be erected on federal land, and they've also refused to officially grant any recognition for them. And I'm in agreement with that. Interestingly enough, how the numbers are really kind of fuzzy on this. One of the main ones that was done was the North Wall Memorial in Windsor, Ontario, and it was erected in 1995. And it cites 173 Canadians who were casualties, including 9 MIA, missing in action, were there. But there are memorials in Quebec, in Ontario, and various parts of Canada, typically near crossing points where Canadians would have gone down to join the U.S.
Mhm. I think it's also important to remember that Canada was officially a non-belligerent uh, state during the Vietnam War, and excuse me, Canada's Foreign Enlistment Act is pretty clear about what it says, that it is against the law to go to war for another country besides Canada. I mean, it's very clear on that.
It's very clear, and it was. I think that it's probably no coincidence in the date when that act was passed, which is 1937, which was right around the Spanish Civil War, and there were thousands of Canadians going off to fight in there as well. So that's why I think we're here today, is kind of reminding ourselves that during these times of extreme political rhetoric that we're seeing on both sides of the border, that Canadians, Americans, we're better as friends than not. So let's pour one out for the forgotten fighters, while noting this was a political tightrope for Canada. We're in a political tightrope situation right now, and we have been in the past. And Canada's very purposeful lack of official participation in Southeast Asia, and there was a law, like Rejoy mentioned, making it illegal for Canadians to participate. The 1937 Foreign Enlistment Act was on the books and still is. It did not prevent up to 40,000 Canadians from enlisting in the U.S. Armed Forces during that time. And although it has to be noted, when I talk about a political tightrope, not one of those 40,000 Canadians was ever prosecuted by Canada for violating the act. So the Vietnam War ultimately represents a unique challenge for Canada, as the number of Canadian citizens that participated likely represents the highest total in Canadian history for a war where the nation was not officially involved.
Quite amazing. It's a fascinating topic. So, for final thoughts, Colin, what would you say? What did we learn today about Canadians in the Vietnam War?
I think the biggest one for me was learning that, because a lot of our perceptions of history are shaped by popular representations in media, right? So pop culture in movies, you think of all the different movies out there, and the
Full
perception
Metal
of how
Jacket,
unpopular the
Platoon.
war was.
Yeah.
Exactly. Hell no, we won't go. LBJ, how many babies have you killed today? The reality was the U.S., the war was actually more popular than it wasn't.
That's right. It was. That's
right
right.
up to the end, right?
Right. That's right.
But the people who were making these movies of our generation were also the ones whose friends were protesting and all this kind of stuff. So it colors that perception. So our perception is, we look at it and go, oh yeah, the draft dodgers, there was tens and tens of thousands streaming across the border into Canada, and Canada was welcoming them into their bosom of peacefulness. But that's also a narrative that we're trying to tell ourselves, that we're peacekeepers and we're this and we're that. But the reality is, more Canadians went south to join up and go off and fight than Americans came back here. I mean, the vast majority of Americans who were drafted willingly went and joined and went and did their duty. So it's a challenging one, and I can understand why, if you were a Canadian Vietnam vet, or more in particular a family member, you'd want to see them being recognized. But the reality is, they didn't join up and serve Canada to go off, and so that's where I'm That's where I stand. I don't think it is Canada's responsibility to be giving veteran status to folks who go off and join foreign militaries.
Yeah, I second that very much so. I think, as we were talking about earlier on as well, um, that many of those people, they grew up with people in the neighborhood and who might have gone off to join the American effort in Vietnam, might have come back a little messed up, might not come back at all. Now, if you want to pay tribute to your friend, your buddy, put up a memorial, that's one thing. But I don't think, in my personal opinion, that veteran status should be given to them for that, because it was not an officially sanctioned position of the Canadian government. It's quite different from, say, when you were deployed in Bosnia, in the Balkans in the 90s. Your government sent you out there, along with so many Canadian peacekeepers and troops that were involved at the time. That is an official mission. Therefore, you can be officially designated as a veteran. But if, let's say, Canada hadn't officially sent out any troops there, and you decided, you know what, I think I'm just going to go out there and take a look around, join a militia or join one of the sides and
Which we
spend a
both
year.
know many Canadians did.
Many
And still
Canadians did that.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. That's a whole different scenario. So yes, I agree completely with what you're saying. But one of the other things that I learned from looking into this episode is I didn't realize exactly how much material Canada contributed in terms of supporting the American effort. Because you're quite right. A lot of the perception is, well, the Americans have gone over there, look at what they've done, terrible, terrible, terrible things. And there we have Canada standing back saying, no, can't do that. Don't agree with that. Lester Pearson, I think he won the Nobel Peace Prize, didn't he, for his actions and just his stance on things.
Not for Vietnam. I think that was for
it
the
not for
Suez
Vietnam?
Canal. Yeah,
Oh,
the Suez
okay.
Canal
Well, my
peacekeeping.
mistake.
Yeah.
That's why I should do the research first.
Bah.
But the perception of the Canadians being standing back, being fair, not getting involved in an aggressive war, this puts a whole different spin on it. Officially not sending troops across, but chemicals for Agent Orange, plane parts, ammunition, weaponry. You're pretty involved.
Our whole economy was booming in that period too, because of the expansion in the U.S. I mean, metal, wood, aluminum, steel, all these things that Canada was making and shipping across. A lot of it was being used for the war. Right? We have to not kid ourselves. There's two really cool articles that I'm going to throw in the show notes and post on rumration.ca for folks. One is called The Canadian Way, a case for Canadian Vietnam War veterans, and it's by Ryan Goldsworthy, and it was published in the Canadian Military Journal. That's a really good article that tells a lot of interesting facts here. And another one was called Lost to History, The Canadians Who Fought in Vietnam, written by Chris Corday in the CBC News. It was posted 10 years ago, and it is a phenomenal article. A lot of the information we got about some of the examples we gave today came from these articles. So I just wanted to say thanks to those folks for that.
Indeed. And finally, we were talking about our stance on, or how we feel about Canadians who fought in Vietnam, whether they were, should be officially recognized or not. It's a very loaded question. And you can't say, everyone is entitled to their own opinions. There's no right or there's no wrong. It's how you feel about things. You may have known somebody who fought there or known somebody who lost somebody there. It's a very complicated subject. So, we'd really love to hear from you, our audience, anyone who's listening to this. What are your thoughts on it? Do you think Canada should officially recognize those soldiers who went across and fought in Vietnam? Or do you feel it's better to just have private memorials? Or do you feel that they should just not be recognized at all? We'd love to hear from you and get some opinions out there.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to hear from you. So that's all for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, leave us a review, send it off to some of your friends, share it with as many folks as you can, and maybe ask around. You never know in your community. You might know a Canadian Vietnam vet. They'd probably be in their late 70s, early 80s right now. But you never know. If 40,000 Canadians went down to serve, there's a good chance that someone in your network or in your community knows of somebody who served in Vietnam.
Could well be. And if you really enjoyed this episode, send us some rum. We're running low.
Or at least some Tim Hortons.
We'll see you next time on the Rum Ration.
Cheers to
history.